This is Catholic Forum. I'm Bob Krebs. If you're a regular listener to this program, you would know, as its title indicates, this program gives a uniquely Catholic point of view to many issues and topics. But today on this program, we're going to take a little bit of a different tact. We're going to take a strictly secular view of the very divisive topic of physician-assisted suicide. Our guest today is Jessica Rodgers. She is the Coalition's Director for the Patients' Rights Action Fund, or PRAF, a leading national, nonpartisan, single-issue organization that protects the rights of patients, people with disabilities, older adults, and other historically underrepresented groups from the deadly harm and discrimination inherent in assisted suicide laws. Jessica has a long history of advocacy work, most recently running a program for college students with disabilities. As Coalition Director, Jessica works with diverse stakeholders across the country and to protect the vulnerable from assisted suicide legislation. We have to welcome the Catholic Forum, Jessica Rodgers. Jessica, thanks for taking time to do this today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
We're usually, of course, the name of the program is Catholic Forum. We're usually going after things from a Catholic point of view. Mm-hmm. We've already talked about the Catholic point of view on this program of physician-assisted suicide, why it's against Catholic teaching. So I wanted to get you on here today to talk mostly about the secular side of assisted suicide. So we're going to be talking about that primarily. So let's start with what is assisted suicide and how does that differ from euthanasia?
Well, that's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify those terms. They are sometimes used interchangeably. Euthanasia is when a doctor actively performs an action to end the life of a patient. That's normally an injection, and that's legal in Canada and in other European countries that allow this practice. Assisted suicide is here in the US, and it does require that the patient self-administer the drugs, and that's what distinguishes it from euthanasia. The role of the physician is to prescribe the drugs, and then the patients take it on their own, and there are often no witnesses, or if there are witnesses, they don't report back information of what has happened. Assisted suicide here in the country is a policy. They vary a little bit state to state, but the bare bones are the same, that if someone has a terminal diagnosis of 6 months or less to live, in the states where this is legal, they can go to their physician. In some states, that can also be an advanced practice registered nurse, a nurse practitioner, or physician assistant, and tell them that they would like a prescription of lethal drugs. And then, as I said, self-administer those.
Mm-hmm. So really, that's the main difference, is self-administered rather than administered directly by a physician. So, but who's to say? Who's there that can tell whether it's being administered by the patient themselves or by a family member or someone off the street? There's no real control of that, correct?
Correct. And that is one of the significant problems with this legislation. Yeah. The state really washes their hands of these most vulnerable patients who have gone to their doctor actively requesting drugs to end their life. And then there's no oversight after that. And we see that played out from the Oregon Department of Health. They report that over 200 people last year. It's unknown if they had complications. It's unknown how long it took them to die. It's unknown if anyone was there with them. It's unknown if they had capacity at the time that they took these drugs or if they took them of their own free will.
Yeah. So let's talk about House Bill 140. It's the bill here in Delaware. It's already passed out of committee, of the House committee, and now it's on the ready list to go before the Delaware House of Representatives. Give us an overview of that legislation.
So the Delaware legislation does mirror what we see in other states where there's that 6-month diagnosis, a doctor has to sign off on it, and there has to be a second physician. What has to be noted there is that the doctor doesn't have to have a relationship with the patient, and there's no requirement that the doctor be an expert on that prognosis or that the patient has tried any treatments that are available to them. So what we see in Oregon is that people self-report that they don't want to feel like a burden on their family, and they report that at a much higher rate than they self-report pain or even fear of future pain as a reason that they're seeking these prescriptions. HB 140 would mirror those same bare bones of the Oregon law. All of these policies, there's a general waiting period between the first request and the second request, and then the death certificate is falsified to write whatever the underlying condition was, which makes it incredibly difficult to investigate any instances of abuse here.
Is there a physician-assisted suicide bill in Maryland as well, or just Delaware at this point?
In Maryland, one was just introduced at the beginning of February.
Okay.
So we are anticipating a hearing sometime in March. Right now it's set for March 5th. That, of course, can always change.
Yeah. And is that very similar to the Delaware bill?
Very similar. All of these bills are really very similar. They vary in who exactly can prescribe, in whether or not there's a requirement to be a resident of the state. They vary in the length of the waiting period, but the basic bare bones and the people who are at risk are the same in every state.
What are the ramifications? Why is assisted suicide bad for the community in general?
Well, we're talking about creating a government policy that actively carves out a segment of the population who are already inherently more vulnerable and more scared. They have a terminal diagnosis. They're already facing down mounting medical bills and healthcare costs, these changes that happen naturally towards the end of their life. They're facing this down, and now you have a government policy that says when they feel like they're a burden on their friends and family, a doctor will agree with them and give them drugs to end their life. And the ramifications of that for society means that we stop looking at our friends and our family and our neighbors as people who need appropriate care when they express those feelings. And we instead start to agree with them when they express those feelings. And that's incredibly dangerous. And I'll take a moment and speak to this personally. I got involved in this work because my mother had a terminal diagnosis and I was her caregiver, and we lived in Oregon where this is legal. And you start to look at your doctor and wonder, can I trust you to provide the best possible care? Can I trust you to fight for me as we're facing down this diagnosis? When I could look at you and ask for lethal drugs and you would say, yeah, I understand. I wouldn't want to feel like a burden either. And instead help me to end my own life. And there is a rupture in the trust of that doctor-patient relationship when this becomes, state sanctioned suicide for some people. It is inherently discriminatory.
I've also read where in states where, in other countries where this is law, the overall suicide rate goes up. Even young people will see this and say, "Oh, it must be okay, to commit suicide," even if they're not doing it through the physicians. Have you found that to be the case?
I don't think it's surprising that when you create a government policy that actively devalues life and actively says that if you feel like a burden, we agree that you should end your life. I don't think it's at all surprising that we would see societal ramifications among people that are not terminally ill.
How about, now you did touch on this, but what are some of the ramifications? Why is it so harmful to the elderly and the sick, and especially those folks who are disabled?
Well, these are the populations that are most likely to get a terminal diagnosis. And when we look at the reasons that people self-report seeking these drugs, they are primarily reasons of disability and reasons of not wanting to feel like a burden. Pain has never been a top 5 reason. So for people who have disabilities and are experiencing the disparities within our healthcare system that exist, the ableism within our society that exists, we have studies showing that doctors already believe that people with disabilities have a lower quality of life and they have to fight harder for equitable care. And then you introduce something like this into the equation, it starts to change the background noise of how we view people who face more physical challenges, people who are facing significant healthcare challenges and who need help, and what we define help to be in our society. People with disabilities are incredibly concerned about this legislation. We see major disability rights organizations nationwide and statewide that take a position consistently opposing assisted suicide because they know the harm that it causes and the particular vulnerabilities that their constituencies face when you sanction discrimination against some people who are already so much more vulnerable.
So I think the answer to this would be to increase our assistance to those with disabilities and to put our efforts and our money into palliative care for those who are in the final days of their lives. And also, isn't it quite difficult for a healthcare professional to accurately estimate how many months you have left to live if you have a terrible chronic or a terminal illness, right?
You're absolutely right. Doctors, and all respect to doctors, but they are terrible prognosticators. And I think, anyone listening to this, if you really think through in your life, who do I know that outlived a 6-month diagnosis? You might be surprised because it's a lot of people. Yeah. And we even see, again, from the Oregon Department of Health, we see that people have gotten these prescriptions and held on to them for years before they take them. So people are actively outliving this diagnosis. And we are, instead of offering hope and help and healing to people that are sick, we are instead saying, well, if you just want to end it now, we understand. And if you don't want to rack up medical bills for your family, we understand. Why would you even try? And something that I hope your audience will walk away from this understanding is that there's nothing in this bill requiring that you try treatment. So that means that if you are going to die within 6 months with or without treatment, you would qualify. So that means that in Oregon, we've seen people with diabetes having that as a qualifying condition. We've seen young women with anorexia being given lethal drugs, which is not in the medical literature accepted as a terminal medical condition and is in fact a mental health diagnosis. But the doctor makes the point that without treatment, you'll die within 6 months. And therefore, under the practical application of this policy, those young women qualified. So once you open this door, there really is no closing it. We certainly all know people who have conditions that require regular treatment, but we wouldn't naturally think of as being terminal, but they would qualify.
Yeah. It is definitely a slippery slope. I know that's a cliche, but it certainly fits in this instance. My guest today on Catholic Forum is Jessica Rodgers. She is the Coalition's Director for the Patients' Rights Action Fund, and we're happy to have her on the program today. We talked about the impact on the aged, the ill, the disabled, and on the community as a whole. How about for the medical community? Doesn't it put them in a very bad situation?
Well, if you believe that, you're in good standing. The American Medical Association has long been opposed. They say that assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role. And I think that's very true. You see the National Organization of Nurses with Disabilities, numerous doctors, even at this last Delaware hearing, were there testifying about how this ruptures the doctor-patient relationship. And frankly, having something like this as an option really changes the background noise of how doctors start to view their patients. And we do, unfortunately, live in a system that is very insurance and cost driven. And as healthcare systems are trying to find ways to save money, having that background noise change of what kind of care or killing you can provide to your patients, that has to have a significant impact in how doctors are able to do their jobs.
You mentioned that a lot of these physicians organizations are opposed. Can you give us a rundown of the organizations that have come out in opposition to assisted suicide?
Absolutely. So the AMA, the CDMA, numerous medical organizations, National Organization of Nurses with Disabilities, the American College of Physicians, United Spinal, the ARC, the National Council on Independent Living, Not Dead Yet. I could go on and on. There, we have just dozens on our website that have signed on to saying this is dangerous for our communities and the communities that we serve, and we want no part of it.
Why do politicians think that they know better than the doctors? I know that's just a rhetorical question. I'm sure you don't have the answer to that, but it's something that I wonder about very often.
I wish I had that answer. I think it would make my job easier if I
Sure.
did.
Now, the main organization that is a proponent of assisted suicide is an organization called Compassion and Choices. What do we know about them?
So, Compassion and Choices was birthed out of the Hemlock Society, which was around decades prior. They were founded in part by Derek Humphrey, who wrote the book Final Exit, and spoke a lot about rational suicide, and essentially wrote a handbook for anyone contemplating ending their own life, giving ideas and how-to helpful tips. Really, really disturbing the way that he would write about people and write about the role of suicide within a society. So this is kind of the start of the Compassion and Choices movement, is somebody who just said, no, anybody and everybody should be able to kill themselves, and anybody and everybody should be able to help anybody else who wants to die. And it's perfectly reasonable in a society to say that if you are no longer able to contribute and you're old or you're sick, then yes, it's very reasonable to just take your life at that point. So those talking points didn't get them very far. Through the 90s, it got them legalization, hard fought in Oregon. But after that, they started their talking points, and they started talk about, no, this is about just for people that are terminally ill, and this is about death with dignity and having a dignified end, and really focusing on people who had really terrible, understandably terrible end of life experiences. And then that messaging hasn't really worked for them. So then they've morphed it, and they talk about compassion, and they talk broadly about freedom and broadly about autonomy. And they don't really dig into how this is impacting vulnerable patients at all. They talk about it in very fluffy terminology. It kind of mirrors a little bit what we've seen out of Canada when they started their program, which they call MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying. And they literally have a PR campaign that looks like a perfume commercial of somebody celebrating making this choice to end their life, and how wonderful it is, and just it's all rainbows and butterflies. And that's really the kind of language that Compassion and Choices now is trying to evoke. And they don't really talk at all about what the underlying issue is. They just tell legislators, this is a bill about freedom and autonomy, and you're forcing people to suffer. And they are not really honest, frankly, about the numerous abuses that we've seen where this is passed. And they're not honest about the fact that they come back to those same states later, and they expand the law, and they reduce the waiting period, and they sue the state to get rid of the residency requirement. And they certainly have goals of further expansion from there.
Wow, that's incredible. And at the beginning of our conversation today, I said I'm not going to bring in the Catholic part stuff, but I'm going to mention that I've talked to a lot of priests who are at the bedside of parishioners as they pass, and they say that it is practically unheard of for someone to be suffering at the end of their life. So the medical community has great ways to make people comfortable as they approach the end of their lives, and so suffering really isn't a thing that's an issue. Would you agree with that from what you know?
I would. I think that's bared out by what I've heard numerous palliative care doctors share, that we've made wonderful advancements, and that there is no reason for people to be suffering as they near their end. And I think that mirrors what we see in states where this is legal, where people aren't choosing it for pain. It's for reasons of disability. It's because they don't want to be a burden. And that's frankly a really shameful reflection on the rest of us, that our loved ones would have to self-report that.
And if someone who feels like they're a burden would just go to the people they love and say, "Am I a burden?"
Yeah.
Chances are they're going to say, "Of course not."
Right.
Anyway.
No,
Well,
those are natural feelings
yeah,
for people
sure.
to have. So.
Yeah. Jessica, how can our listeners, viewers get more information and how can we take action?
Absolutely. There's a lot of action to take in Delaware. Please, please, I know you hear this all the time, but please call your legislator, email your legislator, tell them you do not want this. This is not a bill that we can afford to get wrong, right? This isn't something that you come back and fix later. We get this bill wrong and people die. Please call and email your legislator. There's the great website up on the screen, stophb140.com. There's more information there on how to get involved. There's also a link to send an email directly to your legislator. And you can go to our website, patientsrightsaction.org. You can contact me through there. And if you are not in Delaware, I'm happy to get you plugged in to whatever state you are in, because we're fighting these battles all over the country.
Jessica, thanks so much for taking time to be with us today on Catholic Forum. And we're all praying that the Patients' Rights Action Fund and all the others who are working in Delaware to defeat this terrible bill are very successful. But thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.